Any institution, whether it is a society or organization in the present country, cannot function effectively without women equal participation in the leadership activities. So we are going to two presentation. The first one is by the Dr. Jasmine, Jesus Mary College, Delhi University. Then Srishti Bal, Nikor Associate, on how people, women and leadership, gender perspective to policy making. Then second one by Nancy Esel and her paper, Women Autonomy, and it's determined in the North and South India. So for the present kind the information, the time limit for the each presentation, 15 to 20 minutes. So I welcome Dr. Jasmine to the begin the sessions. Thank you.
Thank you so much for a warm welcome, and I really want to extend my hearty congratulations to the organizing team for organizing such a webinar. And I think it is really needed in the current times to be debating on issues like this. So we'll start with Srishti, and I'll pitch in for different segments of the slide. Srishti, could you please lead?
Yes, ma'am. Ma'am, if you could just give me a moment to set up the presentation. Good morning, everyone. My name is Srishti Pal, and I'm here with Dr. Jasmine to present a perspective on women's representation in politics and its linkage to gendered policy making. The World Health Organization declared the outbreak of coronavirus pandemic on the 11th March 2020. As the unprecedented virus took over the world, the national leaders faced extraordinary challenges to safeguard the citizens and the economy. Women leaders across the world have been lauded by the media for effectively managing the COVID-19 pandemic and setting stage for a more inclusive recovery, even though they're underrepresented in gender in policy making and decision making spaces. The leadership accounts during the pandemic motivated the authors, Dr. Jasmine and Srishti Pal, to undertake a deeper inquiry studying the trends in political participation and analyzing the differences in qualitative outcomes upon enactment of gender quotas pre-pandemic. The authors argue that the policies enacted to improve representation, such as gender quotas, must be complemented with initiatives that propel a cultural shift, such as recognition of feminine traits under good leadership styles, capacity building and training for women leaders, and gender mainstreaming at national policy levels that redistribute care work and access to educational and financial resources. Moving on to some of the commendable performances of leaders during the pandemic, German Chancellor Angela Merkel simplified complex COVID data results and explained them to the public, further employed scientists, medical experts, and public officials to constantly communicate with the public to avoid fear-mongering and miscommunication. Additionally, Germany expanded care facilities and invested in health infrastructure to avoid overwhelming the existing hospitals, launched mental health campaign to cope with isolation, and undertook aggressive testing that contributed to low fertility rates. Ethiopia's first female president assumed office amidst the global pandemic and garnered international and national press for granting pardon to more than 4,000 prisoners in order to contain the virus. In Bangladesh, Prime Minister acted swiftly, evacuating Bangladeshi citizens from China in early January and conducted regular national broadcasts with citizens. During the broadcast, the term lockdown was avoided in order to avoid panic, and Prime Minister often stepped in as the chief panic diffuser, conducting live streams with frontline workers. To mitigate the economic impacts, Bangladesh rolled out fiscal packages to support the vulnerable sections, enacted measures to stabilize the commodity market and ensure food security. She has also been applauded previously for aligning her policies with the SDG goals and commitment to gender equality. Prime Minister of New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern, was appreciated worldwide for her prompt implementation of mitigation strategies and effective communication. Prime Minister Ardern announced border closures on 15th March 2020, 15 days after New Zealand reported the first case of coronavirus. A 4-level alert system was designed and implemented based on the extent of virus spread that led to flattening of the curve. The precautionary science-led plan was complemented with daily briefings conducted by New Zealand government. The daily briefings were effective because information was communicated consistently, clearly, honestly, and empathetically. The citizens experienced a sense of national unity and greater trust in the government. While female leaders have remarkably responded to the crisis, a blanket correlation between gender of the leader and COVID mortality rates cannot be drawn. Empirical findings suggest that the differences between the gender of the leader and COVID fatality rates are statistically insignificant. The pandemic outcomes are influenced by various other factors such as existing levels of inequality, public healthcare and care infrastructure, demographics, bureaucratic functioning, levels of corruption, and government style. However, findings suggest differences between the responses of male and female legislators. In the US, the gender of the governor had no impact on the likelihood of enacting a stay-at-home policy, rather showed differences in the timeline of implementation. Female administrators were more likely to adopt a stay-at-home policy earlier than their male counterparts. Female displayed both feminine leadership styles such as empathy, community-led approach, prioritizing prevention and trustworthiness, as well as masculine approaches such as enacting tough policies like lockdown, assertiveness, and clarity while dealing with the crisis. Women-led countries opted for a greater percentage of state-level policies such as declaration of emergency, border restrictions, and closure of schools, whereas male-led regimes enacted policies targeting individual behavior, for example, curfew, lockdown, and social distancing. Now I would request Jasmine ma'am to take over and discuss the overall evidence from the world.
Thank you, Srishti. Giving a glimpse into the statistics that are available from various secondary sources, the IPU UN Women Map of Women in Politics was released in 2021, jointly by UN Women and Inter-Parliamentary Union. So the publication puts forward some striking findings from around the world. As of 1st January 2021, there are only 22 women holding highest positions in the state. Out of these 22 positions, 9 include heads of state and 13 heads of government. Europe has the largest number of women leaders. Also, countries in the Nordic region, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, and Norway are led by women. Around 59% of all ministerial positions are held by women in Nicaragua, followed by Austria, Belgium, and Sweden. Canada, Finland, France, and Spain also fall into the category of countries where women hold 50% or more of all the ministerial seats. Also, data has been shared on the kind of portfolios that are offered to women. These are environment, natural resources, energy, social affairs, employment, vocational training, and the like. Now, the data suggests that while women leadership is at an all-time high, the number of women in power and decision-making is still small. Most parliaments are still dominated by men. There are certain countries that have no women ministers at all. And even if there are countries where there is representation, it's very difficult for the women to make their presence felt in politics, primarily because of glass ceiling, or the policy making space is not very conducive. Running for an electoral post is also not easy given the discrimination they have to face, the cultural beliefs that they have to face. Family and social responsibilities also pull them back. So out of all the countries surveyed by IPU UN Women, there are still 12 countries with no women minister at all. So these are namely Saudi, Thailand, Vietnam, Yemen, to name a few. It is well recognized that equal participation of men and women in political and public space, as well as leadership, is imperative to achieve sustainable development goals by 2030. As already argued by Srishti, there is ample literature supporting greater participation of women in policy domain and higher representation in positions of power. And it is believed that greater political representation is going to emanate economic benefits as well as societal development. Globally, the representation of women in parliament is 25.9%. In the lower house, the statistic is 26%, and for the upper house, it's 25.1%. The figure 1 has been taken from WDI, World Development Indicators. So the proportion here is calculated as the seats held by women in a single or a lower chamber out of the total parliamentary seats. As the trend shows, there is a rise in political representation of women, but there is disparity across regions. So there is a secular consistent rise in high and upper middle countries, but the growth has been rather erratic in the low and middle income country groups. So the reason behind this rise in women parliamentarians is possibly gender quotas. To speed up representation of women in parliaments and governments at the local level, gender quotas have been adopted by a large number of countries. And the quotas have also been used by various developing countries to accentuate female representation. Research studies also established that gender quotas have improved women's political representation, but on the downside, many countries are still struggling with an implementation gap in the sense that they haven't been able to achieve the targeted proportion of women in parliament stipulated by their own law. Could you change the slide, please, Srishti? Figure 2 here shows parliament representation of women by region. So as of 1st November 2021, Rwanda in the sub-Saharan Africa has the highest representation of women in the lower house in the world, and around 38.5% of the seats in its upper house are held by women. Rwanda has a set of legislations to bring this change about. It has legislated quotas for the single house, upper house, as well as subnational level. There are no voluntary party bodies. Mexico and Nicaragua in the Americas also have a mix of legislated quotas in place working their way to about 50% of seats in the parliament held by women. Best performers in Europe, Iceland and Norway have voluntary political party quotas and legislated quotas only at the subnational. New Zealand in the Pacific, with nearly 50% of the women representation in parliament, has only got voluntary party quotas. So the evidence on the success of gender quotas appears to be mixed. While the Nordic countries have achieved high levels of female representation in policy space without quotas or only voluntary party quotas, there are countries like Rwanda where the quotas have worked really well. At the same time, it needs to be reiterated that the performance of Asia has been dismal despite a lot of quotas in place. So it needs to be highlighted that the way quotas are implemented also has a great role to play in determining female political engagement. So while quotas for female candidates have brought more women to the political space, the quota system does not necessarily ensure political power to women. The Reykjavik Index is prepared by Kantar Group. It's a leading consulting agency, and they have very, very interesting findings. So they survey perceptions towards female leadership in the G7 countries, along with India, Kenya, and Nigeria. And the report for 2021, based on a survey of about 20,000 individuals, shows an absence of progress in social attitude towards female leadership. The average G7 index stands at 73. Any score less than 100 reflects prejudice towards female leadership. The index scores for India, Kenya, and Nigeria are 68, 53, and 47 respectively. Talking about Nordic countries and Rwanda specifically, the Nordic countries have been leaders in female political representation. Commitment to social justice, welfare, and equality is laudable. The Nordic model, focusing on family and gender equality policies, employment and inclusion in the labor market, with state providing support services like childcare and paid leave to both men and women, actually emphasizes on a dual earner and a dual carer model. And this has actually contributed to both social development and economic development. So as per OECD 2008, Gender equality and improvement in female employment have boosted economic growth in the Nordic region. As per growth accounting estimates, increase in the employment of women in Denmark, Iceland, Norway, and Sweden accounts for about 0.25 to 0.4% points of growth in annual GDP per capita since mid-1960s or early 1970s. In Rwanda, the quotas have worked really well. Women participation in political sphere significantly increased from around 18% in 1990s to around 61% in 2021. Initially, the increased political participation did not bring any significant change. However, later on, it had certain drastic effects. For instance, it propelled women's political identities and agencies, which eventually resulted in meaningful participation. Rwanda has lessons for the world. Economy has been thriving at a rate of growth of 7.76% for 2000 to 2019. Political engagement, education is really at a high. Proportion of women in extreme poverty has reduced. And there is also greater land ownership among women. As per the Global Gender Gap report, coming to India's case, India's ranking in terms of political empowerment is 51 in the world. This is better in terms of the other aspects. For example, it has a ranking of 151 in economic participation and opportunity, 114th in educational attainment, a rank of 155 in health and survival, and a 140th rank in overall gender gap index. Now, as far as the political emancipation is concerned, India has stumbled a lot in terms of its ranking. It was 18th in the report of 2019, and now it stands at around 51. This is largely because a lot of women ministers have been taken out from the political space. Also, the parliamentary representation of about 14.4%, which remains stagnant, is primarily driven by Indira Gandhi's tenure as prime minister from 1966 to 77, and then 1980 till her assassination. These tables here represent the percentage of women in Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha. Out of about 28 Indian states, West Bengal is the only one that has a female chief minister. And analysis at the state level reveals that there are 6 Indian states with no female ministers. Srishti, over to you.
The Constitution of India mandated that the states reserve a minimum of 33% seats for women in directly elected local councils, such as village districts and blocks. A series of randomized natural experiment by Bhima et al. Provide evidence for women leaders having a long-term role model effect. The presence of reservation of women in local governments has reduced gender gap in educational outcomes as well. Women in local councils and government acted as role models, increasing aspirations of children and parents, and less time was spent on household chores by female children. There is further strong evidence for increased reporting of crimes committed against women with an increased female political participation at local government levels. Another randomized policy experiment in India finds that female representation impacts policy decision where women leaders invest more in public goods related to women's well-being. Further increased participation has also positively impacted health outcomes. That is, there was a reduction in infant mortality rates. However, only implementation of quotas has invited backlash from males in communities and villages that strongly uphold patriarchal values. In such cases, appointing a women leader may not necessarily lead to efficient outcomes and gender-responsive policies. There is evidence where a study was conducted across 61 villages in India to report a biased behavior against female leaders. In female-led groups, men are less likely to contribute to public health goods as a result of violation of male identity. Analysis of constituent level data reveals that there is a decline in women candidates after a women candidate's victory, especially in states which have entrenched bias or male-headed parties. Further, there are no spillover effects of women's victory onto other parties or neighboring constituencies. While gender quotas have improved political representation and outcome in electoral politics, it shows no significant impact on participation of women in non-electoral activities. Non-electoral activities include discussion of politics, attending village council meetings, writing petitions, setting up advocacy platforms, grassroots organizations, organizing rallies, lobbying, or communicating needs to officials. Non-electoral activities have a significant impact on electoral outcomes and provide a more comprehensive measure to assess political participation. Moreover, increased exposure to such activities can have a positive impact on electoral representation by encouraging women to contest in elections. Analysis for primary data from Uttar Pradesh reveals that gender gaps in non-electoral participation is far worse than electoral participation. Election of a female village leader results in a minute reduction, an increased participation of 5.8 as opposed to original gap of 31%. It is observed that non-electoral participation is due to supply-side factors such as lack of political agency within households, mobility, knowledge of political institutions, self-assessed leadership scores, and their agency to influence change. Most of the supply-side factors are beyond women's control since they're a reflection of societal values and perceptions. To kind of briefly look at what are supply side, demand side factors and what is the model to traditionally understand patterns of candidate selection. The determination of a candidate is based on eligible pool of candidates, individuals aspiring for a political career, citizens nominated for the seats, and candidates finally elected for the office. The supply side factors include money, knowledge, experience, and motivation, while demand hinges on evaluation of candidates' capabilities and character, which is directly affected by the background. Gender disparity in education, access to financial resources, and health predetermine gender roles, assigning women to care and household responsibilities. Patriarchy embedded in political institutions, social conditioning or gender psyche that deem men fit to lead cause a disproportionate supply of women in politics. Finally, the paper provides sufficient evidence for women's political participation and its impact on growth, health, and educational outcomes. The authors strongly believe that policy improving women's political participation should be included under the broader strategy for post-pandemic recovery. While gender quotas at the legislative level are necessary, they're not sufficient to influence the socio-cultural factors and institutions that affect the supply side issues. The gender quotas must be complemented with policies aimed towards developing the capacity of women leaders, such as leadership training, mentoring, encouraging women to start with small local positions, imparting fundraising skills, improving access to political institutions, supporting advocacy platforms for women, along with overall gender mainstreaming at national policy level to increase women's participation and access to financial, health, and educational resources. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was a well-structured paper. Women and leadership is well presented, Swistipal and Jasmine. So thank you so much. Now I call upon second paper. I welcome Nancy to begin the sessions.
Yeah, Nancy is also a research scholar from Center for Economic Studies and Planning, Jawaharlal Nehru University, though we couldn't actually place her affiliation because she hasn't provided. So sorry not to make that. Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm trying to share my screen. Is my screen visible to everyone?
Yes, ma'am, the screen is visible.
The screen is visible, but not your slide.
Okay. Is it now? I made it full screen.
You can, but it is actually only showing your volume, new volume D. That's
okay.
You open.
I will try again. Is it now visible? Sorry, I can't really hear you. Is it visible now? There's a lot of
It is visible. It's visible. You make it a full screen.
Okay, it's full screen now.
Yeah.
Right?
Perfect.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. The title of my paper is Women's Autonomy and its Determinants in North and South India. It was my MPhil work that I'm presenting here. Okay. So a lot of demographic literature has associated higher status of women with many good things like declining fertility rate, better health outcomes, better education and nutrition of children. Apart from that, high status of women is also associated with higher participation in labor force, as well as higher enrollment in educational institutions. Apart from all these good things, women empowerment is an important goal in itself. And every human being deserves to reach their potential, to actually realize their potential. The objective of this paper is to measure women's autonomy. As we all know that women's autonomy is a multidimensional concept, so I have sought to measure women's autonomy in two dimensions. That's decision-making autonomy and the physical mobility in the two parts of India, North and South India. Further, I have assessed the impact of different individual, household and demographic and spousal characteristics on women's autonomy. I've seen how the women's autonomy varies according to these different factors. So why have I selected North and South India? The reason is that these two regions are on opposite ends when it comes to literacy rate as well as female labor force participation. Some of the states in South have the highest female labor force participation rate as well as literacy rate, while a few states in the North have the lowest female labor force participation rate as well as literacy rate. Apart from that, these two regions also vary in terms of also vary in cultural practices, particularly marrying practices. Like women in South India are allowed to marry within their community, while women in North India are not allowed, like generally not allowed to marry in their close relationships. So I thought it would be a good idea to compare the women's autonomy in these two culturally diverse regions and see how they vary according to different factors. There have already been many studies on the status of women in North and South India. My contribution to this paper, to the existing literature, is that I have taken like all the 8 states of North India and all the 4 states of the South India. I've studied the women's autonomy in these, like in the North and South region as a whole, and not like 2 states in both the regions. And apart from that, most of the studies that, in my knowledge, have been done prior to 2000. So I've used a more recent data, and also I've accounted for like some of the factors which were not taken into account in the earlier studies. So I have used Indian Human Development Survey 2011-12 round, and in order to measure women's autonomy, I have created 2 indices. And in order to assess the impact of various factors on women's autonomy, I have used multinomial logic model. Okay. For decision-making autonomy index, it measures women's autonomy in decisions related to household, children, and themselves. ISDS had various questions which allowed me to make this index. I have selected 4 questions. That's what to cook on a daily basis, what to do if a child falls sick, and how many children the women will have, and whether they had any say in choosing life partner. The answers allowed were they had no say in that decision. If a woman had no say in particular decision, I had assigned a score of 0. And the second option was that women had some say in that particular decision. If the women had some say in that decision, I have assigned a score of 0.5. And the third option was most say. So if the women had more say in that decision, I have assigned a score of 1. So I've assigned the minimum score of 0 and the maximum score of 1. And then finally, I have added those scores in order to make that index. And for physical mobility index, measures whether women were free to move without permission and without being accompanied by someone to the considered places. They are health center, homes of relative or a friend, a short distance by train or bus. If the women so the question was that whether women were allowed, like whether women could go to these places without permission. So I assigned a score of 1 if the women could go to these places without permission, or they just needed to inform someone that they were going to that place. And a score of 0 if women needed permission before going to that place. Further, I've assigned a score of 0 if women were not allowed to go to that place alone, and 1 if they were allowed to go to that place alone. Okay. So the range of these two indices is different. The range of decision-making autonomy index is from 0 to 6, 0 to 4, while the range is 0 to 6 for physical mobility index. So in order to make them comparable, I have standardized them so that they vary between 0 to 1. Further, I have categorized the indices score into categories of low autonomy, moderate, and high autonomy. The score from 0 to 0.39 was categorized as low autonomy. A score between 0.4 to 0.69 was categorized into moderate, and a score of 0.7 to 1 was categorized into high autonomy. This slide lists the factors that I have taken into account. So I have taken into account the individual characteristics of women, including their age at the time of marriage, education, employment status, and past work experience. That is, whether they have ever worked in their life for pay or wages. The second category is household and demographic characteristics, which include caste, religion, per capita income, family structure, that is whether they live in a nuclear family or an extended or joint family, and spousal characteristics, which include spouse's employment status and years of education of spouse. Okay. This slide shows the proportion of women in low, moderate, and high autonomy category for both the indices and for both the regions. Let's look at the decision-making autonomy index first. So we can clearly see that women in South India had much higher decision-making autonomy than women in North India. As high as 60% of the women in South India were in the category of high decision-making autonomy, while only around 25% of the women in North India were in the category of high autonomy. The average score of women in North India on decision-making autonomy index was 0.5, while it was 0.7 for the South Indian women. Okay. So on average, women in North India had moderate autonomy, while on average, women in North India had high decision-making autonomy. Now, coming to physical mobility of the women, it was noted that the trend was opposite, that women in North India had higher physical mobility than the women in South India on average. And we also must note that in both regions, women had lower physical mobility as compared to the decision-making autonomy. And we must note that women in South India had a lower physical mobility despite their higher female labor force participation rate. And that's quite puzzling to me, and I could not really understand why it is so. Maybe some of you in the discussion could point out like why this could be the case, that women in South have lower physical mobility. Okay. The two measures were also very weakly correlated. So it shows that autonomy, higher autonomy in one dimension need not really imply higher autonomy in other dimension as well. So it shows the complicated nature of women's autonomy as well as our society. This slide shows the components of decision-making autonomy index. Okay, so for all the decisions, women in North India had a lower say had a lower decision-making power than women in the South India, but the distinction was most marked for the decision related to choosing the spouse. Okay, so women in North, only around 1/3 of the women in North had some say related to choosing their spouse, while it was close to 90% for women in South India. Okay, this shows the components of physical mobility index. In both regions, more than 80% of the women needed permission to go to the concerned places. The women needing permission before going to the places was a little higher in the South India than North. Women in the North India had higher physical mobility, primarily because a higher percentage of them could go to the concerned places without, could go to those places on their own, while a higher percentage of the men in the South needed someone to accompany them to that place. Okay, now coming to the results of the multinomial logic model. Regarding employment status, it was seen that it had no significant impact on decision-making autonomy of women in both the regions, which was quite surprising, as I was expecting that women doing paid work might be having higher decision-making autonomy, but it turns out it's not so. But on the other hand, women working for pay or wages were more likely to have high physical mobility as compared to non-working women in both the regions. It was quite expected, as paid work often involves women going out of the house, and paid work gives women legitimacy as well as confidence in going out of the house on their own. The second factor that is age. Its impact was quite interesting. Let's look at it through a graph. As you can see from this graph, in both the regions and in both the dimensions of autonomy, women below the age of 30 years had the lowest autonomy. Okay, but as we see that in the decision-making autonomy in both North and South India, and in physical mobility in the South India, we see that the autonomy kind of plateau after 30 years of age, so that women in the age group of 30 to 40 years and above 40 years had kind of, on average, the same autonomy. But it was not so for the physical mobility of women in the North, which increased with increase in every age group. So the impact of age was strongest on the physical mobility of women in the North. For age of marriage, it was seen that women who married above the age of 20 years were more likely to have higher decision-making autonomy in both the regions, while it has no significant impact on their physical mobility in both the regions. Now coming to education. It was noted in both regions that women and uneducated women were likely to have lower decision-making autonomy as compared to educated women. But the impact was most significant and strongest for decision-making autonomy in the North India. As we can see that the average scores moved up with every increase in level of education, but it was not so for the South Indian women, where the average score were approximately the same, or like approximately didn't vary so much. So education, it turns out that education is an important factor affecting decision-making autonomy in the North, but it's not so for the South. So I think it can be inferred from here that high autonomy among women in the South is really cultural in nature. It's because of cultural factors, and education cannot explain their high autonomy. I mean, variation in education cannot explain the high autonomy in South India. For physical mobility index, it was noted that the primary education did not really make a significant difference. It was the secondary and senior secondary education that made a difference. Women with secondary and higher education were more likely to have higher physical mobility in both the regions. For work experience, it was noted that women who had ever worked in the past for wages or were likely to have higher decision-making autonomy as well as physical mobility in both the regions. Coming to caste, okay. So in the north, we see that OBC, SC, and ST women were likely to have lower decision-making autonomy as compared to the general or upper caste women. So caste was an important factor affecting women's autonomy. I'm sorry, is someone saying something? I heard something. Or should I go on?
No, you continue.
All right. Okay. So we see that women from lower caste in the north were likely to have lower decision-making autonomy in the north as compared to the upper caste women, whereas it was not found to be the case for south. In fact, caste did not have a significant impact on women's decision-making autonomy in the south. So again, a strong factor such as caste did not have a significant impact on women's decision-making autonomy. So again, I infer from here that the high autonomy of women in the high decision-making autonomy of women in the South was really cultural in nature. But on the other hand, caste did have a significant impact on women's physical mobility in North as well as in South. In both the regions, OBC and ST women were likely to have lower physical mobility. So we can say that that women from lower caste did not just really face social deprivation, but they were also deprived of decision-making power at home, as well as they were likely to have lower physical mobility in both the regions as compared to the upper caste women. Now, coming to religion, it was found that the impact of religion on decision-making autonomy in both the regions was either not conclusive or it was not significant. But it did have a significant impact on both the regions on physical mobility. In the north, it was noted that the minority Sikh women were likely to have higher physical mobility than the majority Hindu women. Whereas in the south, it was noted that Hindu women were likely to have a lower physical mobility than the Christian and Muslim women. For family structure, it was noted that in both regions, women living in nuclear families were likely to have higher decision-making autonomy. And in the south, it was noted, for the physical mobility also, it was noted in the north that women in nuclear families were more likely to have higher physical mobility, but results were not inclusive for the south. So women in nuclear families are generally expected to have higher autonomy. It's because there are fewer people in a nuclear family to exercise control over women, as well as women in nuclear families tend to have more responsibilities, which in turn give them more freedom. Now, coming to per capita income, it was noted that for both the regions, that in both the regions, women in the lowest income group were likely to have the lowest decision-making autonomy. But the increase in income did not really increase women's decision-making autonomy in both the regions. So what I'm trying to say is that the women in the lowest income group were likely to have the lowest decision-making autonomy, but the women in the middle and high income group, they had no significant difference in their decision-making autonomy. Whereas for the physical mobility, it was noted that women's physical mobility increased with increase in every income group. So the women in the middle income group were likely to have higher physical mobility in both regions, and women in high income group were likely to have higher physical mobility as compared to the women in the middle income group. Now, coming to the spouses' education, it was noted in the north that women with educated spouses were likely to have higher decision-making autonomy as compared to women with uneducated spouses. But while evaluating the impact of additional level of education, that is, I was trying to see whether secondary education had, whether women with spouses having secondary education had higher decision-making autonomy than the women with spouses having primary level of education. It was not it was seen that additional level of education of spouse did not really make a significant difference to women's decision-making autonomy in the north, whereas spouses' education had no significant impact on decision-making autonomy in the south, and it had no significant impact on the physical mobility of women in both the regions. Regarding spouses' occupation, it was seen that it had no significant impact on women's decision-making autonomy in both regions, but it did have significant impact on physical mobility of women in the north, where women with non-working spouses were likely to have lower physical mobility as compared to women with spouses having having some kind of economic occupation. This might be because that women with spouses who have no economic work might have more time to keep a track of their spouse's movement, whereas in the south, spouse's occupation was not found to have any significant impact. Okay, concluding now. So we have seen that the two dimensions of that the women's autonomy in the two regions vary not just across regions but also dimensions across the two dimensions. In both regions, women had higher decision-making autonomy and lower physical mobility. Lower physical mobility of women in the south as compared to women in the north was very surprising given the higher female labor force participation there. And it was found that the correlation between these two measures of autonomy was very low. And further, it was noted that the high decision-making autonomy of women in the South could not be explained by conventionally important factors like their education, employment status, strong social factors like caste and religion, which made me to infer that high decision-making autonomy of women in the South was because of cultural factors. But these factors were important when it came to decision-making autonomy of women in the North. Even spouses' education was a significant factor influencing women's decision-making autonomy in the North. Regarding physical mobility, it was noted that it was responsive to age, employment status, education caste, family structure, and per capita income of households in both regions. Thank you so much. And I'll stop sharing my screen.
Anything? Yeah. Thank you so much, Nancy. It was a well-structured paper. Your analysis, women and autonomy is well presented. So now stage of upon discussion. You can either raise comments and unmute your mic or type in the chat box. Any queries you ask?
Thank you, Nancy, and the previous presenter, Jasmine and Srishti. I have actually a few comments to both of you. First, let me start with the observation, which is I have found from the presentation of Jasmine and Srishti. So my observation is, given that you have talked about the leadership of all across the world, the leadership across the local possibilities are not being explored, especially the cases of Kerala and the other parts, especially the regular intervention of the health minister of Kerala, for example, during the time of COVID pandemic, and her intervention in the very beginning itself, because Kerala was being one of the first state which was reported COVID, and that is herself, that is the health minister, Shailaja was herself, was reporting, and she was behind. And later on, the CM was, of course, being the head of the state, took over. But both of them in regular, not even interval, every day they used to do basically appear in front of the press and used to do kind of give the feedback as well as response. So the role of women, even in that context, especially in the pandemic like that situation, being very active in Kerala, and we were all, that is why it has always had a popular notion that the government was voted in again. So this is something very important, and that is in fact not been explored in the paper, though it just talks about it. And the other part of the same story, in the local body, you have actually around 52 to 52.5, I think, to less than 53% is being women represented in Kerala. Because of quota, 50% is actually being reserved for women. But in Kerala, all the LSGs combined, it is around 53% is women. So that that's a huge number in that sense. It is even greater than the male-female ratio in that sense. So that kind of a local experience, and in the state like Kerala, been not explored in that sense. So of course, we were discussing about other aspects also. So maybe because of the quota, maybe because of other things, and if you actually add that in your paper, things would be much better, because the local conditions are not being explored. So that is what I felt while reading the paper, though largely your concentration is on the international scenario and all, but we cannot actually detach ourselves while doing a research work on it in that sense. So not only Kerala, because I'm making a specific case of Kerala in that sense. There are other possibilities also. I know personally a couple of other issues. But this is a suggestion. If you make this also incorporated in your work, things would be, it will be a better one in that sense. Coming to Ms. Yadav, that is, you were talking about the educational impact, right? In the graph itself, you mentioned that I found a little bit inconsistency in making a conclusion. I'm not saying that your analysis is wrong, but making a conclusion. You said that the North India has a mobility, but at the same time, the value of the South is much greater than North. Is 0.7 plus. That is what I found. So in that sense, maybe there is a mobility from that angle, which was happened in this North mobility in the sense that there is an improvement over, but the value of this South is much higher than even the North. So you can't simply say that there is it is all from your own graph. Okay, so I should be a little cautious in making a statement like that. So that is what I felt. Again, other aspect also, I found the value remains a bit higher in the South when you compare with the.
Should I present the graph again?
Yeah, please. I maybe I'm wrong by observing.
Okay, you are talking about education, no? First one was education.
First, education. I was a little doubtful about it. So.
Let's see. Yes. So did I say that the impact of education was greater in the North for physical mobility? Did I say that?
You're on mute, sir. Please unmute yourself.
Yeah, maybe I'm talking about the decision-making autonomy case.
Okay, decision-making autonomy. Okay.
Yeah.
So, okay, I want to clarify here that my main point was that the impact of education on decision-making autonomy was greater in the north, as the average score, like they increased by a greater amount, like a greater proportion in the north as compared to the south. You can see that the variation wasn't much across the education levels in the south for the decision-making autonomy, I am saying. So it's clearly that women in South have higher decision-making autonomy, but the variation is across education level is lower for the South as compared to the North. So from here, I inferred that the impact of education was greater in the North as compared to the South. So what I'm saying is that the education level of education did not really have a significant impact on women's decision-making autonomy in the South, but it was not so in the North.
But still, I'm okay.
Okay, please say like if there's any confusion here. Like
actually, maybe because of the graph, I'm unable to figure it out. Like you have a high things which is in the white or a silver, proportion.
Yes.
At the same time, the same is actually maybe increasing for the over the education class, but it is very high in the south, right? So
yes.
very high, like 70% in that sense.
Yes, it's very high, but I'm talking not about the absolute high percentage. I'm talking about the variation. If you see that the average.
Oh, you are talking about the difference of the difference. That is okay. I understand.
Yes. I'm talking about the variation.
But that is only an effect, right? That is not, that is what I'm a little worried about. That's only an effect. But overall, you can't simply say that the north-south divide in that sense. So because once you have a higher, it is just like making that, when you have a literacy above 90%, it is difficult to increase at 1%. When you have a literacy at 20 or 40%, it is possible to increase at a 20% or 10% in an easy way. So it's something like that. When you have a higher rate, improving that higher rate to a next level is difficult and not impossible. The rate would be always small. But
that's what I'm saying. Like the overall background of higher literacy rate in South has implied that the decision-making autonomy of women, like the high decision-making autonomy, has permeated to all the women. So even uneducated women have higher autonomy in the South.
That's true.
So the effect of education in that sense is not significant in the South. That's because the overall level of literacy rate is higher. So it has become a cultural thing that the high decision-making autonomy in the South has become a cultural thing that even uneducated women have higher level of decision-making autonomy. But in the North, since the literacy rate is not high, it's on the lower side. That's why even a small increase in the education level have a significant impact on the decision-making autonomy of the women in the North. That's what.
Okay, that point I understood, but that doesn't mean that the overall decision-making is actually having a high. Okay, that is what I was a little confused.
Okay, I'm sorry for that. Maybe I spoke something wrong, but my point is that women in the South.
Now I'm understood. I'm clear. I'm completely clear.
All right.
So you're talking about that increment, basically. Thank you.
Yes. So sorry for the confusion.
Yeah. Thank you.
Sir, can I respond to the comment earlier?
Of course.
Yeah. So very well received, and we totally understand, sir. This is a work in progress, actually, and we've just started exploring this topic. So the first stage of it was basically to present international experience and compare it with what's, let's say, happening in India. Definitely dig deeper into different aspects of it. So currently we are working into some empirics of it. The results are not very great, so it was slightly risky to show. in the presentation. And we are definitely going to develop upon this idea and run the analysis in different dimensions. Thank you so much for this opportunity, and thank you for your comment.
Thank you. Anybody else want to respond? Because we have time to discuss.
I need to, so Nancy, can we please go to the slide where you've selected the determinants for creating the index, in case you could do that?
Yeah.
Sure. It's a very interesting study.
There is a question actually, Jasmine madam.
Oh.
In the chat box.
Right. Yeah. So should I respond to the question first?
Yeah, meanwhile, she'll come back to the other.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, of course, with whatever survey of literature we've done and whatever statistics we've come across, we find that women leadership in Nordic countries has played a pivotal role in terms of development and good economic outcomes. Also, also as was discussed in the presentation, the policies and the implementation of policies, especially the dual learner and the dual carer model, has really worked for this segment, though there are drawbacks and there is still much to be done in terms of labor force participation and equality of representation of both men and female in the employment domain. But still, the Nordic countries have a lot to teach the rest of the world. That having equality and greater political representation and bringing about feminine traits into political domain can have positive aspects. Thank you.
See also questions in the chat box. Yeah. In your summary of multi-logic model, you have mentioned the same result for the North and South India, especially in case of employment, which so not significant as per DMA. Can you please justify it? Yeah.
Am I audible?
Yeah, audible.
So even I was expecting that women who are employed in paid work must be having higher decision-making autonomy in both regions. But actually, the odds ratio, they showed that women doing paid work were likely to have higher decision-making autonomy, but the results were not significant. This is quite surprising for me, but that's how things are. That means that even women doing paid work, they are not accorded higher autonomy in both, higher decision-making autonomy in both of these. Did it answer the question?
Yeah, it's marking.
Sorry?
It's marking can.
Sorry,
Yeah.
I'm really sorry, I couldn't hear that.
You did. Thank you. Yeah, you did. Thank you.
All right.
Nancy, the slide where you are defining the indices, those bullets, those that tabular flowing chart.
Yeah.
Right. So, Nancy, as far as the decision-making index is concerned, any factor related to financial decisions that they take?
No, I haven't included in this index.
Okay.
Like I have done like that for another paper. I've had another index, that economic autonomy index. I have taken into account like that factor, financial independence there.
So what does that financial independence entail? I mean, if you were to define financial independence?
It was that it had various components. As
Right.
far as there was one that whether women had any bank account. There was one that whether they had some cash at the point when the survey was done, and one was related to purchasing of expensive item, like whether they are consulted whenever any expensive item is purchased in the household.
Right. Thank you so much.
But the results, I worked on it long ago, so I can't really remember the results. But
no, I'm asking because we were sort of floating a similar survey, so I thought it'll be better to ask you once.
All right, you can have a look at the IHDS 2011-12.
Yeah, that's a good source. Yeah. Thank you.
Anybody raising the questions? Please the chat box. Anyone?
If no one's having a question, I would like to ask a question regarding my own work. I pointed out it in my presentation as well, that women in South India were found to have lower physical mobility despite their higher labor force participation rate. Could anyone would like to shed light on it, like why it could be so? Was it because of cultural factors? Because I have no idea about it. I thought maybe some of you would have a better idea about it.
Can you repeat the question?
I was saying that women in South had lower physical mobility than women in North, even despite having higher labor force participation rate. I was very surprised by this result. I'm still puzzled why it is so. So I couldn't really explain it.
The labor participation rate of women in Kerala is abysmally low, basically, in Kerala. Other part of India maybe, but we have only 26% as a labor participation, one of the lowest in because we are not very good in having women labor work for participation rate. So we were also looking for the same question on why this is happening, because the largest segment of the educated women in the state becoming the part of that is what yesterday's discussion altogether. Yesterday and day before we were discussing about this, because the larger segment of the educated women are being in the household actually. After their education, they are getting married and normally they are part of the capitalist production structure. That is what is actually everyone talking yesterday and day before. Because the unpaid work constitute the surplus in that sense, because they are doing household chores instead of going for a paid work or, kind of thing. So it's very well fit into the arguments of the left or the Marxist literature, not with the right. Of course, this unemployment is also absolutely, add to the, capital accumulation process, because it also creates a kind of surplus in that sense. So maybe Kerala, in that sense, you can say that becoming capitalist in that sense more and more, because maybe, I don't know, but this is one way of actually looking at the problem. You can still have a possibility, and it is quite well rationalizable kind of statement if you look into the very aspect of it, because of the kind of work which is happening and the kind of lower participation of labor, and of course the wage rate also in Kerala is not very high. Again, when you have a caste class characteristics, the men are basically doing lesser household unpaid activities, especially when you look into the composition of the men. It is the upper caste men who are not doing at all any kind of a unpaid work in that sense. So they have more leisure in that sense, whereas the low caste men are at least sharing the household chores in that sense. So when you argue that who is actually makes a kind of a surplus or accumulation, then that itself gives a kind of composition in that sense. Again, this add to your point that the women are having lesser mobility because they are in the house. So maybe because of that. But if you take the case of Tamil Nadu, I don't think the same argument will fit, because Tamil Nadu, you have a more mobility in that sense of women when you compare to Kerala and other parts of the state, because women themselves are educated and the other has better autonomy. You have to segregate South and North. The broader category may not give you, because they are not homogeneous. Kerala are absolutely having difference in all kinds of activity, especially when it comes to women. All right. So, and same the case with the Karnataka, and you can see Andhra Pradesh and Telangana. So South, in that sense, we are completely different. Everyone speaks different language. Culturally, we are completely different. Though you can see that the larger context, we don't have a unifying kind of a language even in South. So you have Tamil, you have Malayalam, you have Kannada, you have Telugu, and all this is in fact a very distinctive, maybe common ancestry, but not the culturally also. When you look into the educational status of women, or even the mobility status, health indices, and other aspects are completely different. But they are better doing. When you compare them as a block with the North, many of the aspects, it makes a difference, but not on the mobility aspect. I completely agree with you.
Thanks so much. I think I've got an important suggestion that I should look for different states.
A disaggregate kind of lens would be better. Even within South North, you have to basically concentrate, because of the non-homogeneity, or what you call the heterogeneity, is actually very prevalent among all the states, and their characterization is also should be forming accordingly. That is what I said. You in the earlier the women's participation, because of the quota, you have a 50% quota in Kerala only. Okay, earlier we legislated 33% first in the country. So so then these are actually the kind of thing which deliberations are there, but it doesn't mean that we are filled. But at the same time, in the Legislative Assembly, we have only 12% representation. So you have a 53% in the local body, but at the same time in the Legislative Assembly, you have a 12% or less than 15%. So I'm not thinking that the progress is only in progress, but it is not yet achieved in that sense. So in Parliament, we have only one women representative out of 20. All right. So so these are the situations which we have to see, and of course, the larger patriarchal sense is always spearheads than the capitalist interest, because capitalist interest is always alliance with the patriarchy, not the vice versa kind. So patriarchy is actually the building blocks in India, and caste is of course much prevalent than even patriarchy. So I think we need to really look into the aspect, like simply go for economic reasons and some peripheral class issues. We have to our research should be more on other social, cultural, historical aspects than simply going with the economic indices alone. So that is what is always my hunch. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yes, I completely agree. I should do a state-wise analysis and taking into account social, cultural, and historical factors would be important here. Thanks again.
Thank you, ma'am. Next, I have one query, Jasmine. So this paper deals with policy enacted to improve the representation, such as gender quotas.
Yes.
It's necessary to study the.
Sorry to interrupt. I think Shrishti had raised a hand.
Yeah.
Maybe Shrishti wants to ask Any question or comment?
Actually, sorry to interrupt, just to add on to the question that you had asked on, if I'm getting your question right, it's about you're looking for other factors other than employment which might affect mobility decisions. Is that where you're coming from, Nancy? You're on mute, Nancy.
Yes, my question was that on average, women in South have higher female labor force participation as compared to women in North.
Mm.
So based on that, I was expecting a higher physical mobility of women in the South. But as Siddiq sir has rightly pointed out, that like the South, even South is not a homogeneous region, and Kerala, which has the highest literacy rate, has one of the lowest female labor force participation rates. So, so I cannot really say that the women in the South should be having higher physical mobility. Of course, there are many important social, cultural, and historical factors which need to be taken into account. So I should not really point out at the employment status to be an important explanatory factor for explaining the low physical mobility of women.
I think you can also relate it to gender-based violence and also kind of look at visibility of women in public infrastructure places.
Okay.
So
that's really important position.
That, I mean, when you look at, so for example, let's say women working in the South, I mean, what kind of transportation facilities they use to commute to their workplaces, and what is the level of safety within those public infrastructure spaces. And maybe that might help you answer your question. Also kind of looking at these reports by Safety Pin, the safety audit reports, like in transport spaces. So how does that entirely play out? Or even stuff like, something as small as availability of a washroom within a safe washroom within public transport spaces. So that might kind of help answer your question about mobility and autonomy with respect to mobility. So that's, and of course, gender-based violence in terms of violence at workplace and violence within households and violence in the public transport infra. These three aspects.
Thanks a lot, Shrishti. I think they are very
Thank you.
important.
Actually, I have also I would like to add on because Srishti had made a very important point. But at this time, when you have actually in the official data, there is an issue with the official data also, because you have to be little careful. So there are states where you have a high rate of reporting, and you have actually states which have no reporting. So especially when it comes to violence, we do have discussion on it. When it just comes with a divorce, we have discussion here and there. Because the level of reporting of cases is much, much higher in the state. Therefore, in the official statistics, the number of cases would be greater always in Kerala. But at the same time, the violation, because I have been traveling all across this country, I know the kind of violation which happens there and the level of reporting, if you look into the data set, official data set, is never matches. Okay. So this always actually brings out a dilemma that, if being a good state of actually reporting higher becomes actually you rank you at a lower end of the spectrum, on the contrary. So this is also a kind of word of caution, which I always kind of feel, because of the level of, because I was working in law and economics for a while. I know that different aspect. So this is a very important point I used to observe when you compare that with the other states. So reporting makes your state a bad state. But reporting itself is actually a kind of manifestation of telling you that you have more rights. because unless you have your right recognized, nobody can actually report. So there is a problem with it. From that angle, nobody is actually looking into it. And people will say that if you have a higher rate, then you are bad. It is also comes with the fact that you are having a higher rate, at the same time you are also having a higher rate of right consciousness. Okay, so our narratives, our discourse, and our way of looking into the problem should also has to reflect this kind of aspect, because then of course we ourselves know that things has to change, but blatantly making a statement never makes any kind of constructive result. That's it. So there are reports. You will get actually crime report if you look into all this aspect. You will get national crime report if you look into jail report. You have a marriage kind of things. You have a divorce reports. Everything is having. The divorce rate is very high in Kerala. So immediately people are Kerala is it's bad. From a law and economics, if a higher rate of divorce means higher autonomy for women to say actually that I don't want you. Okay. So I don't any longer want to continue with your marriage. So what does it mean? It means that you have a right over it, right? So things are completely different, but the discourse changes then. So thank you.
Thanks, both of you. Shrishti had made very important points. I'll definitely take them into account. And thanks you, sir. Like you have made a very important word of caution. Like it's generally seen that it's like for UP, it's seen that the reported rate of domestic violence is very low, but it's high for Kerala. So we really need to see it from the right perspective, like that where the reporting is high also means that people have a right to report, whereas in other states where reporting is low, women generally don't really have a right even to report. Thank you so much for this.
Thank you, ma'am. Jasmine, madam. Yeah. I have a clarification, not clarification, it's a common question. This paper deals with the policy enacted to improve representation such as gender quotas. Necessary to study the trends of women in political participation and analysis, quality difference, and gender responsive policy making. Yeah. What about women in political participation in India? So Kerala also gender discrimination in political parties. So it's a common question. So you think answer it.
Sure. I'll be answering on behalf of Dr. Jasmine and I. If I'm getting your question right, is it about why haven't we addressed discrimination or gender disparity in political representation in Kerala? Or I couldn't get your question.
India also, India. You explained India. It's not Kerala.
Right. So Dr. Jasmine does present a very skewed situation in India as well, where we have about only 9.1 women legislators in the national parliament, and that's a very, very small number. We had 23.1% and it fell down to 9.1%. So yeah, it is a skewed situation, and hence we argue for gender quota so that the demand for women legislators is created. And in order to kind of work out the supply side factors and ensure that there are capable women standing up for electoral posts, we suggest policy responses such as ensuring that women have access to these mentorship and leadership programs with respect to political leadership. Did I answer your question?
I would like to add to this. In our presentation, we are also talking about Rwanda. Now, this story is not very old. It was in 2003 where there was a massive genocide, and quotas over there have really helped women, come to the surface. They are doing very well in terms of political participation and other social aspects. So what we're arguing is that there is no dearth of quotas. Developing countries are taking cognizance of the fact that there should be greater representation, but having just quotas in place does not solve the problem. You also need to give them the right policies, the right kind of a framework where the quotas will work. So this paper largely takes lessons from different regions in the world that have done well with or without quotas, but have managed to have a good representation, and then comparing India's economic level case. And the next step to this paper is basically to delve deeper into what the state level analysis says. So definitely there will be states where the representation is higher. There could be states where there is no representation at all. For example, we've highlighted in our presentation also. There are studies that have done a pan-India analysis in terms of the performance of women in political spaces across different constituencies, and they've found significant results that the constituencies that are led by women have performed well. But then that's also a matter of econometric exercise, and we are definitely going to take a step towards it. So yeah, that's our argument.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. Thank you
so much. Thanks a ton.
Yeah. Thank you, ma'am. It was well-structured two presentations. Thank you, Jasmine and Srishti Ball and Nancy. Our topic on women and leadership and women and autonomy. So well-structured paper. So interesting, and it's a new topic. I think that so further clarification, doubts, and further improve the paper. So thank you, Siddiq sir also. We have came to the last part of the sessions. So I welcome Albert Raju, the second MA.
I have to make a small announcement before.
Okay, sir.
That is actually the participation certificate as well as the presentation certificate will be distributed. We'll be sharing the Google Doc. So if you fill it, then you will get your certificates in the afternoon first session. All right. So yeah, I think some of the participants might have received it. I think. Yeah, because we have made. Okay. Yeah. Over Albert.
We haven't received, sir. Sorry.
Okay, then we'll get it. No problem. Otherwise, I'll share the Google Doc and just fill it and you will get it. Okay.
That'll be great. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Albert, deliver the vote of thanks.
Good morning to all. I'm extremely delighted to be a part of this seminar on one of the most relevant subjects, that's women and development. Here, my duty is to share the gratitude to all. First, I would like to thank Mr. Muniraj K, MPhil Scholar, University of Kerala, who wonderfully moderated the session. Thank you, Muniraj. Next, I would like to thank the speakers, Dr. Jasmine, Jesus and Mary College, Delhi University, and Srishti Pal, Nikor Associates, for presenting a paper on the topic, Women and Leadership, a Gendered Perspective to Policy Making. Next, I would like to share my gratitude to Ms. Nancy Yadav for presenting a paper on the topic, Women's Autonomy and its Determinants in North and South India. Again, thank you for all for your amazing presentations. Next, I would like to thank Ashwin AP of Department of Economics for the welcome address. At last, not the least, I share my gratitude towards all the participants in the session. Thank you all and have a wonderful day.
Thank you so much. The afternoon session start at 2 p.m. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you once again, Dr. Jasmine, Srishti, and Nancy Yadav.
Thank you so much, sir. It was very, very engaging. Thanks a ton.
Thank you for having us.